Hello, my name is Daniel Hutchinson. I'm a professor and chair of the history department here at Belmont Abbey College, and this is Conversatio, the podcast of Belmont Abbey College. You can follow us on Spotify, Apple, or Google Play and keep up with what's happening here at the Abbey and in our community. Today it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome to our campus Suly Chenkin. Suly is a resident here of Charlotte, North Carolina, and she's here to share with us today her remarkable journey and her remarkable experience during World War II and the Holocaust. And it's our great pleasure here at Belmont Abbey to help her in sharing the legacy of an experience, although 80 years ago, which is profoundly important and reverberates in our world today. And we're honored to share in her mission of sharing the story into the future. Suly, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Please tell me a little bit about your life, your experiences there in Lithuania, and how life changed when the Nazis arrived in 1941.
I was born in Lithuania, in the city of Kovno or Kaunas, and which was at that point the provisional capital of Lithuania. I was 6 months old when the Nazis came into Lithuania, and everything changed for us Jewish people there. Right away, there were all kinds of rules and regulations, and the Yellow Star of David, which had to be worn at all times. Some 8 weeks later, we were all commanded to go into a designated place. Anybody caught outside of that designated place after August 19th, 1941, would be shot to death. This designated place was then called the Kovno Ghetto. It was surrounded by barbed wires. They put in 38,000 of us in a place where up until that time maybe only 10,000 people lived, and it was the poorest part of town. The overcrowding, the lack of food, the terror, disease took a lot of people, and by the time October came, we were like 27,000. At that point, we were all called to appear at a certain early hour into an open plaza in the ghetto, stand by family units. Nobody could stay in their houses. The houses could not be locked. Anybody who stayed in their house would be shot immediately to death. And it was, we stood there from 6 o'clock in the morning. My parents took turns in holding me. I was 8 months old, 10 months old. And it wasn't until like 9 o'clock when the commandant had had his breakfast that the selection started. You go to the right, you go to the left. And it was in this manner he selected some 10,000 people, mostly the infirm, the handicapped, the elderly, and the small young children. They were all taken away, never to be seen again. The rest of us were sent back home. Started a period in our lives where everything was terrible. They burned down the hospital, they burned down the orphanage with people in it. It was a terrible, terrible time, but we somehow lived. My father got the job of being in charge of the bread distribution in the ghetto, and it was a very difficult job because you had to keep books like if it was a regular business. You had to basically keep tabs on how many pounds of flour were sent, how many were baked into bread, how many slices were given out to the people. And people would come and try to bribe my father and tell him, please give me more and I'll give you whatever I was able to hide from the Nazis. And my father would not take a bribe from anybody, not even for himself or for me, the baby. And without aiming to, he kind of gained the trust and respect of his boss, who of course was not only a Nazi, but he was also part of the SS elite killing machine. And he would come to our house after business hours. The Nazis came in the morning, transacted all the business that they had to in the ghetto, and then they would leave back to their barracks at 6. But he would stay and come to our house, and I remember him. And he would give my father real news, not propaganda. I mean, not that we really knew anything other than what he told us. And he would tell us, we were right at the doors of Moscow, and we couldn't take it, and we lost Stalingrad. And so that gave us some hope. But then there were other news that started infiltrating and rumors. And then the woman who had been my nanny the first few months of my life, when my mother was still working and we were free, she came to the barbed wire gates and asked to speak to my father. And when he approached her, she told him, I have relatives that came to visit me, and they are from a town that is about 100 miles away from here. And they told me that in their town they also have a ghetto, and that the Nazis came in and rounded up all children under the age of 12, save the baby. And he said, take her. And she ran away, because harboring a Jew was not only punishable by death to you, but your entire family would be put to death. So at this point, my father went to his boss and he said, so is this true? And the boss said, yes. And if you want to save your child, you have to get her out of here. So he gave him a safe conduct that he could leave the ghetto under some, pretenses of transacting business, looking for flour, whatever. And he interviewed people who, by word of mouth, he had heard were willing to take the risk and money to save one of ours. And it was touch and go, this one yes, this one no, and time was running out when on the 27th of March, 1944, the Nazis just came in. And I remember that day because my father woke me up, and I still really was very, very sleepy, and I was ready to protest. And his face was like he was so frightened. It was terror that was reflected in it. And he picked me up, and my mother, he and I went to the staircase, and my mother she bent down, picked up a slat of wood, and there was this round hole, and she jumped into it. And then my father handed me to her, and I remember it because I hit my head against that round rim. And I just remember my mother's hand over my mouth and her mouth in my ear, begging me not to cry. I know it hurts, she said, but I beg you, don't cry, because if they hear us, they'll come and kill us. And soon enough, the first day they didn't come, but the second day, when they realized that there were more than 900 children in the ghetto under the age of 12, that there were more, they came back. And that's when they came to our house. And I remember their footsteps and their screaming. And one of them had an axe, and he held it over my father's head and said, take me to your bunker. We know you Jews have bunkers all over the place. Luckily, the house we were in had something called a ice cellar. In the old times when people didn't have refrigeration, they would put their perishables in the summer deep under the house in so-called, and with chunks of ice. So my father took them there, and they broke down with their things. They broke down walls and floors and destroyed half of the cellar, and not finding anything, they left. But from that day on, I was not allowed to go out on the street, and my orders were if the front door opened and the person didn't identify themselves immediately, I was to run and hide under the bed. My parents were getting really desperate. They knew they had to send me out. When they hear about this woman who's willing to place me with a Lithuanian Christian who's willing to risk their lives. The only trouble is she's going to be the mastermind of the plan. Not only is she Jewish herself, she comes from a very religious Jewish sect. People who, a little bit like the Amish, they stick to their own, they have their ways. She has never heard anything but liturgical music, but somehow, I don't know where she got the nerve from and how she did it, but the plan was made. I was being brainwashed, even at the age of 3.5, that my parents had to give me away, that they loved me, but that the bad guys were out to kill us, and I could never ask about them, ever, or they would come and kill me and kill them. And at a prearranged time, I was given a sleeping potion. I was put into a potato sack. My sack, containing me sleeping there, was loaded right in front of the Nazi officers onto a cart that had sacks of potatoes, real potatoes, and the driver had an order that was signed by my father's boss, who did not know about this operation, and he signed it, and giving my father the okay to take it to the grinding mill in the outskirts of the ghetto to grind it into flour to make potato bread for the ghetto. At a prearranged time, along the barbed wire in the outskirts, the cart made an unscheduled stop. There were 2 women standing on the other side of the barbed wire. Miriam Schulman, the mastermind of the plan, the Jewish lady, and a young girl by the name of Albina, who was about 18 years old, a Christian girl, who was going to hide me. And my sack was gently thrown over the barbed wire. The 2 women ran to it, tore the sack open, and placed me in a carriage and wheeled me away to what everybody prayed would be a chance to live. I don't have to tell you that when I woke up, I cried a lot, not really knowing where I was, what was going on, but I never asked for my parents. I just cried a lot. My war was over in no time because I was sent out on May 11th, and on August 1st, the Russians came in and the Nazis ran. But the ghetto had been liquidated. At the beginning of July, all the inmates had been taken out of the ghetto, and then the ghetto was dynamited and burned to the ground. The inmates had been taken to the train station and separated, the men from the women. All the women were sent to a concentration camp in Poland called Stutthof, and all the men went to Germany to the concentration camp Dachau. And I stayed in Lithuania. My war, like I said, my war was over in no time, and we stayed there. And Miriam realized at one point that the Russians were not good people either. They were communists, and that we would not be able to leave. And her husband had been cut off from her. He had been in New York when the Nazis had come in, and her parents had gone to Israel years before, and our aim was to get to Israel. So at one point, in January of 1945, we escaped Lithuania, and it was one of the coldest winters recorded. And we went to Lublin, and then things were very bad in Lublin, so we left and went to Białystok, and from Białystok, Poland, we went back to Lublin. Anyway, we ended up in Bucharest, and that's where Miriam was finally able to get the certificate that allowed us to go to Israel. It took us 10 months to get from Kovno to Bucharest. The distance is from New York to Miami. And it was a horrendous trip because, of course, we had no documents, no real documents, and very little money. And we finally did get to Bucharest, and on the month of my 5th birthday, we boarded the ship that took us to Israel. Now, I had never asked for my parents, because even though war was over, there were tanks on the street. There were a lot of soldiers with machine guns. And so even when Miriam asked me one time, "Do you remember your parents?" I just turned my head. I wouldn't lie to her, but I didn't want to speak about it either. But since we were told that we were going to the land of milk and honey, where we would not have to be afraid anymore, and where, we would have enough food, and we would even have toys and eat chocolate, whatever that was, once we got there and I put one foot on the port of Haifa, I turned around and I asked the man who was standing next to me, "Where's my mother?" Because I looked and I didn't see anybody familiar. And he didn't want to tell me the truth, which would have been, "I don't know, and nobody else in this world does." So he said, "She's in the next town, and the next town, and the next village." And finally, when that night we finally got to Jerusalem, I turned around and I said, "Stop lying to me. I know I'm an orphan." And that very same night, I started calling Miriam Ima, which is Hebrew for mother. And that was that. In the meantime, my mother had been liberated by the Russians in January 1945, and they had taken all these women that they had liberated from Stutthof to a place that was a camp. It wasn't a hard labor camp. It wasn't like they were beating them up, but they were still not free. They were now under the Russian regime. A young man came looking for his girlfriend. The Nazis were so methodical that you could almost see the history of the places where people went. All the women from Kovno were sent to this place. All the men were sent to that place. So you could follow. And he came looking for his girlfriend, and the women milled around him asking, "And who else is left? You were in hiding and you came out. Who else is left?" And he started enumerating people, and then he said, "You remember the guy, the redhead, who used to be in charge of the bread distribution in the ghetto?" "Yeah." "Well, she's got his kid, and she's taking her children and that kid. They're trying to get to Israel, and they're right now on the way to the city of Lodz in Poland." My mother fainted. It was the first news that she got that I was alive, and she immediately made plans, and she escaped that camp right in front of the machine guns. She made a run for it, hid in somebody's garden, knocked on their door, begged them. She managed to get to the village a few days later when they weren't looking for her, and get on broken trains, buses, whatever method she could. She had, whichever way, she came to the city of Lodz. She went to the Jewish agency that kept tabs on people and was told we were already on the way to Israel at high sea. She came out and she stood in the middle of the street crying because all she had was her dress, no underwear, half-torn shoes. She had been on a death march that the Nazis had taken her at the end of her stay at the concentration camp. She had no money, nothing. She was never going to see me again. When these two young men stopped on their tracks, as they passed her by and said, "Aren't you Riva Bejkovic? Your husband is alive. He knows you're alive and he's waiting for you to come to him. He's in the American zone of Germany. He is in Munich." So these two guys and my mother made the trek. I don't know how, but with broken down buses, or they stole bicycles. My mother said they rolled down hills. They finally got to the border that separated the Russian zone of Munich from the American zone. And of course my father had been liberated from Dachau by the Americans, so he was in the American zone. if you didn't have the proper documents showing that you lived in Munich before the war, of course they had no such documents. They were put on the train that was going back to the Russian zone. My mother and these two guys climbed to the roof of the train that they had been put back on, and when the train they had been taken off from passed them by, they jumped from one moving train to the other, and that's how my mom got to my father. My father's family had moved to Cuba many years. He was the youngest, so he had stayed with his mother, and my father had written many, many letters through the Red Cross. Finally, one such letter got to my family in Cuba, and they learned that my parents were alive and that I existed. My uncle started proceedings for papers to bring my parents to Cuba, but it took a long time. My parents, in the meantime, stayed in Munich. My father was working for the Americans in the displaced persons camp, and I was in Israel. I was a month away from my 6th birthday, and Miriam had called me over at the dining room table, and she said, I got this picture in the mail, and I want you to tell me if you know any of these people. And she showed me the picture, and my heart skipped a beat. And I said, this was my mother, and if the man had red hair, this was my father. And she embraced me and she said, they still are your parents. They're alive and they're coming to get you. And I didn't believe it because I had been lied to before, but it was true. And my mother and father went to Cuba. My uncle picked them up and brought them to Cuba in July of 1946. Then the family took my mother to New York, and all they could find was a freighter that went to Israel. And she boarded that freighter and came to Israel, and I was at a play date, and my eldest siblings came to get me, foster siblings, and they said, Ima, which is Hebrew for mother, wants to see you. And I was very worried because she only summoned you if you had done something you shouldn't. And I came running around the bend of the house screaming, Ima, Ima, I'm here and I haven't done anything bad. When this lady came out of the house onto the porch, and she stopped and I stopped, and then she opened up her arms and I ran into them in full recognition of my mother who had come to get me. And then I froze because she was a stranger. And then started that period of, having two mothers. First I had none, and now I had two. And it was a little difficult for both ladies and for me. And my mother and I moved to Tel Aviv from Jerusalem, so I could start, bonding more with my mom. And we had to wait for documents because all of a sudden Cuba didn't want to let me in. So my mother had arrived in September, and it wasn't until February that we were able to travel to Cuba. And I arrived there on February 6, 1947, and was reunited with my father. Out of the 40,000 Jewish people that lived in Kovno before the Nazis invaded, only 2,000 remained alive. And it was a miracle that a family, my mother, my father, and I, remained intact. Out of children under the age of 12, only 3% survived. So I was very, very lucky with the people who saved me.
When your family reunited, what sort of future did you make for yourself? And how did the legacies of those past shape that future?
Well, we came to Cuba, and we were very lucky. My father had a wonderful family in Cuba. His brothers, his sister, cousins. I grew up with a lot of love, surrounded by a lot of love, and I was very spoiled in many ways with gifts and everything. I mean, when I graduated high school, before my last exam, there was a knock at my door at lunchtime, and it was my uncle's chauffeur with a key in his hand. And he said, "Your uncle has sent you your graduation present. The car is downstairs." So it was wonderful. And then Castro came, okay? And this country was wonderful in letting us in. I came on first as a tourist, and then when, Castro declared himself communist, and I came on my own. My parents sent me out again. I had relatives, but they sent me out again. And then I came what they called the DACA, that's asylum. And then my parents came after Castro confiscated most of the businesses in October of 1960. And we were in textile in Cuba, so there were a lot of the suppliers were here in Charlotte. Yarn suppliers, machinery suppliers. So my father and his brothers came here and started a small textile factory. And then I came, and I stayed here for about 6 months, and then I went on to New York. I got a job in an export company. I used my Spanish. I worked on the 75th floor of the Empire State Building. I called my father and I said to him, "I got a very high position." And he said, "How much are they paying you?" I said, $70 a week. He says, "What's so good about that? You were making that in Miami." I said, "I'm on the 75th floor. How much higher can I go?" But I stayed with that job, and I ended up, being partner. For 22 years, I lived in New York and stayed with that job. I got married in New York, and then in 1989, at the end of 89, I came back with my husband here to Charlotte, and I've been here since.
That's wonderful. I know for people who have experienced such challenging experiences, sharing that with others is very difficult. What inspired you, what called you to share your experiences as a child with the world and with these communities?
Well, I never did. I grew up in Cuba. My friends, they knew I had come from the other side, that I hadn't been born in Cuba, but I never talked about it. Never talked about being a Holocaust survivor. As a child, I wanted to be just like everybody else. As a teenager and everything else, all I was interested in was music and dancing. And that was it. Then I came here and I didn't talk about it either. So I was 50 years old when my father had a massive heart attack and passed away. And a few weeks later, the bankers came, to pay their condolences and to see what was going on in the factory. And one of them said to me, "Your father had promised my son to come to his school and tell his story. Will you do it for him?" And I said, "Of course I will." And I went, and when I saw the reaction of the kids and the letters they wrote me, I knew I had to keep on doing it, and that's when I started. Wow. I haven't stopped since.
Well, thank you for continuing to share your story. What do you think is important for the children of today and of tomorrow to understand about this moment in history and why we need to never forget the things that occurred in this moment?
Right. Well, I tell the children, I'm very active at the Living JCC. We have a program that is called the Butterfly, and children come from different schools, and then we have a survivor answer their questions. They see a film with a story, and then we answer the questions. And what I'm trying to tell these children is, first of all, I always tell them that when I came to Cuba, my world was divided very clearly in two parts. One was Jewish people and the enemy. Because even after the war, everybody stopped us with documents that were not good, sent us back. We had to, do all kinds of tricks to get where we were going. So that was the way it was. And because I played outside on the street, and all the neighbors adored me and had little treats for me and presents and hugs and kisses, and my parents got along with all their neighbors, I was totally convinced that all of Cuba was Jewish. And it took until Christmas to realize, no, you can't have a Christmas tree, that I knew the difference. So I say always, it doesn't matter what is the name of the God you pray to, it's what you have in your heart. And that we're all the same. So that's one of the messages. And I also tell them, look, it took one man to kill 1.5 million children. Look how many people it took to save one little girl.
But it's the courage of those individuals in the face of the unimaginable that made your life possible, and it's a credit and a wonder that you're doing the same for helping us today and for those of tomorrow to understand your story. So thank you for sharing your experience with us and with our community.
Thank you so much for doing it.
Absolutely. One day, it will be more challenging for educators and historians to communicate this moment in time because we don't have those who lived this experience to share. Do you have any advice, or what do you think is important for us in trying to continue to tell your story and the story of others who lived through this experience for the future?
Well, it's, there's already been deniers, and there will be always deniers. But it just so happens that the Nazis have been very methodical about really having everything in black and white. There's 22 kilometers of filing archives, filing cabinets in a town in Germany, which tells the story. And they have documented everything. Like in my town, Kovno, they have the documentation signed by the commandant of how many children, how many women, how many men they killed on what date. So it's there. It's only by remembering the past that we don't make the same mistakes in the future.
Absolutely.
So we just have to keep on trying, documenting everything. Today we have all this wonderful new methods of filming, of being able to do podcasts, being able to take stories and showing them.
Yeah.
And what we're doing at the JCC is tremendous, because those children are able to ask how many questions as they want and get their answers straight. And we keep on trying. That's all we can do.
That's all we can do.
Right.
In your years as an adult, did life ever bring you back to Israel or to Lithuania?
I will never go back to Lithuania. My father asked me not to. He said it was covered with our blood. But I have been many times to Israel, yes.
I see. For those who wish to learn more about this experience, do you recommend any museums or institutes, or maybe tell us a little bit more about the JCC community?
Well, I would like somebody who's here to tell it, because she is the one who runs it, and she can give you a very good idea of what it is. As far as museums, yes. There is of course, the Holocaust Museum in Washington. There also happens to be a museum in Richmond, Virginia, that is about the Kovno Ghetto. It is their thing. If I may add one little story.
Please.
That I heard from my father when, maybe shortly before he died. He had never told me about this. My father was really, dying. 80 pounds. It's not something you can live on. But without knowing it, the Nazis were losing the war. They didn't have any manpower to work their fields, and Dachau is really an agricultural area. So they, at one day, they just took the inmates out. And my father got the job in a farm of tending the vegetable garden. And it was right behind the farmer's house. And there was this farmer's daughter, found out it was the daughter later on a window, poised on a window, staring at him. He said to me that he must have looked like a scarecrow. He was, that striped uniform, unshaven, unbathed. And the girl threw him a piece of bread. And he looked around, no guards nearby, put the piece of bread in his uniform. The next day she threw him another piece of bread. The third day she said, "Sprechen Sie Deutsch? Do you speak German?" And he went like that. She said, "Don't die. What you hear is not thunder. Those are the American planes bombing our cities. Hang on, soon you will be free." And that gave him more strength than the pieces of bread. And he did hang on. And then time passed by, and he was, the Eisenhower liberated Dachau. My mother came to him. They were waiting for papers from Cuba that would allow them to leave Germany forever. They knew that I was safe and sound, and they knew the papers were coming any day now. The Germans had nothing. Their cities had been bombed to the ground. Most places didn't even have drinking water. And my father, working for the Americans, had everything. So knowing that soon they would be leaving, he and my mother took 2 baskets and filled them up with coffee and sugar and soap and whatever. And they went out to the farmland and found the house and repaid the one act of kindness that was done to him throughout those years.
It's a remarkable story. Remarkable. In moments that are so dark, the kindness of a stranger could be the light that can keep people going.
Right.
In times of today and in the future, we'll face future darkness. How do you think we can maintain hope and find those connections that keep that spark alive?
You know something? I think there was a dual reason for the gesture. It was not only to show the girl the gratitude, but to convince himself that despite everything that had happened to him, he was still capable of having that feeling.
Remarkable. I want to thank you for sharing your experience, your life, the story of your parents, and your story of becoming an American. And thank you for your work in sharing this with communities here in the Charlotte area and with us here at Belmont Abbey College. I wish you continued opportunities to share this with the children of the community and with other communities. And thank you for your work in keeping this part of our history, such an important part of our history, alive.
Thank you for doing this.
Absolutely.
Very much.
Thank you. I want to thank you again for joining us for Conversatio and encourage you to continue to keep up with our activities here at the college by keeping in touch with our podcast. Thank you.